Our sermon today is in two parts, and because I'm bigger than David, I get to go first. In my family home, the staple food that my mother cooked, whether it was Christmas dinner or just leftovers on Monday night, was a kind of fried cornbread. She made it every day, and I grew up watching her make it from the time I was old enough to stand up in the kitchen and look over her shoulder. She poured a generous amount of coarse ground cornmeal into a large mixing bowl, added a pinch of baking powder, some salt. She then scalded the mixture with boiling water and then vigorously stirred in a little bit of buttermilk. And this thick mixture was then fried in bacon fat into little oblong, look like pancakes, basically, a grainy kind of pancake fried on both sides. Now, stacks of this cornbread sat by the stove every day, and if anybody got hungry between a meal, you could go get a piece, put some butter and jam on it, or put peanut butter on it, and that was what we had to hold you into the next meal. Naturally, when I moved away and started cooking my own meals, I kept trying to make fried cornbread, and I could never get it right. So I have in a folder of family recipes my mother's handwritten formula for making fried cornbread. I could have come closer to making our family's fried cornbread if I just asked Siri for the recipe. And Siri wasn't around before my mother had passed away. So whatever my mother's cooking skills were, they were felt and not documented. The handwritten recipe that she gave me would not be enough to make a single piece of cornbread. She clearly had no sense of how much she was putting into the bowls. She just felt it and unconsciously did it. I'm not saying that it was health food, but I'm saying that it tasted good and it kept a house full of perpetually hungry adolescent boys from starving to death before dinner time. And so far as religion is concerned, if Jesus had grown up in my home, if it was Jesus of Glasgow, communion would be cornbread and a glass of cold whole milk. And no, I'm not going to start making cornbread for our weekly communion observance, though it would be better. My point in all this is to say that, like cooking, the origins of most religions were done by feel. Moses, as we take the Exodus account, had empathy for the enslaved Hebrews and led them to freedom and self-determination. Jesus, having been brought up in occupied Judah, became a religious and social reformer who elevated the outcast and the abused through a ministry of radical compassion. Muhammad basically had been a caravan pirate who sought to unite and civilize the warring tribes of the Arabic Peninsula. Now, one can't really know anything about the historical Moses. We have no idea if any part of that narrative is historical, but if you take it at face value, his job description was liberator of the slaves. We can't know much about the historical Jesus, but what we do know indicates that he was at least a teacher of compassion. We probably know a little bit too much about the historical Muhammad, but from what we can reasonably assemble about the traditions that began Christianity and Judaism and led to Islam, we can say that the historical Moses would not recognize either the temple sacrifice or the rabbinic text-based faith that followed it. It would not be anything that he would understand as being something he had started. My good friend and founding member of the Jesus Seminar, Dr. Charles Hedrick, is fond of reminding me that the historical Jesus probably wasn't religious at all. Hardly a decade after Jesus had been executed by the state, Paul stole his name and his reputation and invented a religion that had almost nothing at all to do with Jesus. And a generation after Paul had been executed by the same state, the Roman Church turned Christianity into something that Paul wouldn't have recognized, and that I'm positive the historical Jesus would have absolutely hated. Now, most of you know all of this morning. Everybody here knows this, but let me spell this out plainly for our listeners. None of the New Testament was written during the lifetime of Jesus. Paul's letters are the oldest part of the New Testament. It is almost impossible to believe that any part of the Gospels were not written at least partially in response to and influenced by Paul's entirely uninformed religious views. So we read the Gospels looking for hints and echoes of what the historical Jesus might have said and done, but what we find there behind the later layers of Paul's theology and the editing of Rome is a controversial teacher who challenged the prejudices of his culture regarding the role of women, the second-class nature of Gentiles, prostitutes, and lepers. He evidently was defiant towards the authority of the occupying government, sufficient to get him killed, probably with the consent and help of the indigenous religious authorities from among his own people. But like trying to duplicate mom's cornbread, you can't reduce Jesus, who he was, and what he tried to do by putting it into a creedal statement and then trying to express it in rituals and dogmas. What Jesus was, in essence, was good, compassionate. So much so that people who personally knew him thought that he was holy, Amen. That he was somehow so much better than the peers around them that they continued to meet in his name and tried to be more like him. The religion that evolved in his name over the next century was, in many ways, the antithesis of simply being good. And it led to people fighting battles for centuries, asking churches not to imitate the goodness of Jesus, but to codify Paul's kind of strange interpretations of who Jesus was. What happened to Muhammad was similar to what happened to Jesus. Once Muhammad was dead, his story was hijacked by people who needed for him to be more than he was in life. And traditions grew up around his birth and childhood that made him more competitive with prophetic figures in the Old and New Testament. But the truth is that he was largely a product of his culture. Muhammad had several religious experiences, mystical experiences, before his first vision, as it was described in Muslim tradition. He was something of a mystic and maybe not entirely stable. When he had this famous first vision, he interpreted it as an encounter with an evil genie, and he thought he might have been possessed and actually went out to kill himself. When he told his wife what had happened, she sent him to see her cousin, who was a Christian mystic. And it was in that conversation with them that his wife sent him to her cousin Wakara, and it was Wakara's interpretation of his experience that said, no, this was not a genie, this was the angel Gabriel, and began massaging his message, his experience, into the language of Judeo-Christian theological narrative. Muhammad, Khadijah, and Waraka shaped the early version of the poetry of the Quran, Muhammad dictating it because he was illiterate. His wife could read and write, but he couldn't. Jesus probably couldn't either. Later generations would make the whole thing out to be a miraculous composition dictated to the prophet from God through the angel. But as I've said to you all before, God doesn't write books and angels don't exist. And if God did write books, it would be better than the Bible or the Quran. Trust me, I'm sure that the divine spirit of the universe could do much better than either one of them. But Muslims claim that the Quran is God's one and only perfect miracle. But there's not much in it that you would find memorable. Some of you may have tried giving it a read. It doesn't yield itself to nice, pithy quotes in very many instances. However, there are some sayings that are popular in our language that we assume are Christian values. My mother used to say all the time, God will never give you more than you can bear. That's not in the Bible. It is in the Quran. But I never told my mother that she was quoting Muhammad. I think that there are some religious myths that are best left alone. But I say all of this by way of echoing what Joseph Campbell said, which is that all religions are true as long as you take them poetically, metaphorically, existentially. But as soon as you try to distill them down into creeds, dogma, sacraments, church teachings, belief system, then you kill the whole thing. The larger truth is that there is no authoritative book to tell us how to live or how to think. There is no one religion that trumps all of the others. We are all just mortals, and all of us are just trying to figure out how to be good people. Some ways of being religious seem to help in the process of becoming a good person. Others seem to hurt, and it's up to us to find a way to think our way through, to feel our way through, to navigate between what is clearly false and evil and what is truthful and helpful.
Amen. Amen. Double duty David. Yeah.
Just as an aside, the cornbread sounds really nice, and it sure beats the saltines and mustard that we would get if we did communion like my grandma's house. So. Well, I'll stay with the juice and plastic.
Whatever.
Right? Yeah.
The label says it's wheat.
Well, as long as I can remember, I've been less interested in teasing out those verifiable details about the historical Moses or Muhammad or Buddha or Jesus. I've been much more interested in exploring how communities have related to those stories and teachings. Questions like, who was thinking about these things? Who thought it was worthwhile to remember these things? Why were these ideas remembered and repeated? What made them worthy of that in these communities? How were they understood and applied? And how did different communities and different cultures and over different times interact with those same stories and teachings in really different ways? As I've mentioned before, what I find most compelling is the potential of religious traditions and communities to either hinder or liberate our humanity. So it really isn't a problem to me that the New Testament was written after Jesus' lifetime, or even that the earliest Buddhist scriptures were preserved orally and not even written down for nearly 500 years. If, as Roger said, we're all just mortals trying to figure out how to be good people, and if some ways of being religious help us to do that and others make it harder to do that, then what we realize is the process of this discernment is what's been going on all along. This is the real heart of the human religious expression and experience, that we've been trying to sort through all these things, in Roger's words, to navigate between lies and truth. And it's probably been going on mainly in haphazard ways. We probably haven't given as much intentional thought to what we're doing as scriptures are written down and preserved and traditions are created and passed on and adapted and tossed out. We also can realize that discernment is the most important and urgent task for religious folks today, and that we can do it intentionally with the goal of giving human beings the best chance possible to live in wise and kind ways. And if religion can't do that, then there's not really a point in preserving religion. I stress that the task is urgent and that our efforts need to be intentional because, as we all know, and as Roger was mentioning, religion's track record is really mixed at best. It's certainly historically true that religious folks have spilled a lot of ink and a lot of blood while arguing over the truth of their religious claims, while using religion as a weapon to marginalize, exploit, and oppress folks they labeled as different. Buddhism, which has a reputation for being among the more peace-loving religious systems, has not been immune. because Buddhism, like all religions, has been created, maintained, and adapted by human beings. Approximately 535 million people in the world identify as Buddhists, almost 8% of the world's population. Within Asia, 67% of those people practice in one of the Mahayana traditions, another 28% practice in one of the Theravada traditions, and about 3% practice in one of the Vajrayana traditions. That leaves only about 7 million Buddhists in the world who don't live in Asia. So for anyone unfamiliar with Buddhist cosmology, entering into and encountering that world can be bewildering, to say the least. This is especially the case if you have a notion that Buddhism is merely a philosophy and not a religion. It can be merely a philosophy, but for most of those 535 million people in the world, it is a religion. And this is also the case if you're unaware that there are thousands of Buddhist sects that have arisen over the last 2,500 years. And what that means is that the Buddhism that exists in the minds of many of us in the West often has very little to do with the actual histories, cultures, geographies, and practices of Buddhists in Asia. Buddhism, like other cultural and religious systems, is much more easily romanticized than it is understood. So I want to be really honest about the very human limitations that Buddhist individuals and societies have experienced. For example, 2 weeks ago, I helped provide a tour at the local Buddhist temple, to a large group of university students. And after we finished up, one of them approached me to ask what I thought about the situation in Myanmar, which is always interesting to me how people who are identified as religious leaders get called on to give commentary on complicated political situations. You know, that's not my area of expertise, but in this case, there's really not much good to be said about a nation engaging in ethnic cleansing. In the newest wave of violence against the Rohingya people, beginning in August 2017, almost 700,000 more people have fled Myanmar to escape state-sanctioned violence. The ongoing repression of this vulnerable people has been made even more bewildering by the inaction of a Nobel laureate and current state councilor Aung San Suu Kyi, who was formerly an icon of engaged Buddhism. Instead of speaking out and acting on the behalf of the Rohingya, she's justified the atrocities and persecuted journalists who had something to say about it. Suu Kyi and about 90% of Myanmar's population are Buddhists. The beleaguered Rohingya are Muslims. Similarly, one of my own past Buddhist mentors was formerly a human rights worker in Sri Lanka, providing mediation and protective accompaniment for high-ranking officials and diplomats who were involved in trying to bring an end to their civil war. That war lasted over 25 years and killed nearly 100,000 people. About 70% of Sri Lankans are Buddhist. I could tell more stories, but in all of these kinds of cases, there are contributing circumstances that require thoughtful analysis. But some of these horrible acts of oppression and violence were justified in the minds of the perpetrators as a defense of Buddhist identity. And in all of these cases, a Buddhist identity and culture was not enough to prevent them from happening. That's kind of depressing, isn't it? So is it inevitable that human beings will get lost, confusing those metaphors with dogma? Is there any hope at all? There is, and one example of it is found in the aptly named Amazing and Astounding Qualities Sutta. And if you ever get a chance to read Buddhist ancient texts, the names of the suttas are quite wonderful. So this sutta starts off with poetry and metaphor. You really get a sense about how miraculous stories were remembered and handed down in the Buddhist tradition. The setup is this: after an alms round and a meal, the monks are all gathered together and chatting away. And what would they be talking about? Of course, how great and wonderful their religious leader is. So they're extolling the miraculous qualities of the Buddha Gautama. And just then, and this happens a lot in the suttas, just as they're talking about these things, the Buddha strolls in. He says, "Hey guys, what you talking about?" And so they tell him, "Oh, we're talking about how wonderful and great you are." And the Buddha says, that being the case, Ananda, his assistant, elaborate to a greater extent. the Tathaga's amazing and astounding qualities. And that title, Tathagata, is a title the Buddha often uses for himself. So that's just what Ananda does. And it is quite the list. From the Blessed One's mindful and alert lifespan in the Tusita heaven before his final rebirth, to the measureless radiance that pierces the entire cosmos when he, in their words, alighted in his mother's womb, to his miraculous birth. And I'm going to read you part of the account from the translation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu. When the Bodhisattva left his mother's womb, he left it immaculate, unsullied by fluid, unsullied by mucus, unsullied by blood, unsullied by lymph, pure, very pure. 2 streams of water appeared from the sky, one cool and the other warm, to wash the Bodhisattva and his mother. As soon as the Bodhisattva was born, he stood steadily with his feet on the ground, and facing north, he took 7 steps, while a white parasol was held over him. Surveying all directions, he made a bellowing statement, "I am the foremost of the world. I am chief of the world. I am the best of the world." And the fact that when the Bodhisattva left his mother's womb, this 10,000-fold cosmos shivered and quivered and quaked, while the great measureless radiance appeared in the cosmos, surpassing the effulgence of the Devas. I hold this, too, to be an amazing and astounding quality of the Blessed One. That's not the type of Buddhism that you're used to being represented on the cover of Mindfulness magazine, is it? But for any student of ancient religions and ancient texts, it really doesn't come as a surprise. The remarkable features are, so to speak, unremarkable. But I wouldn't be reciting this text if that is where it ended. The Buddha, having listened to the litany of praise, replies in this way, "That being the case, Ananda, you can hold this, too, to be an amazing and astounding quality of the Tathagata." And you could just see it, right? The monks now are really bracing themselves. Something more amazing and astounding to that? What is it? Kind of edge of your seats kind of thing. And the Buddha says, "There is the case where feelings are known to the Tathagata when they arise, known when they remain, known when they go to their end. Perceptions are known to the Tathagata when they arise, known when they remain, known when they go to their end. Thoughts are known to the Tathagata when they arise, known when they remain, known when they go to their end. You can hold this too, Ananda, to be an amazing and astounding quality of the Tathagata." For me, that reply is remarkable. Here we have the preservation of a tradition that insists that what is amazing and astounding is the very human capacity to reflect on our experience and consciously, intentionally choose to cultivate what is wise, kind, and just. The tradition also holds that the Buddha said that he taught only 2 things: suffering, that is, understanding suffering, and the end of suffering. And that seems like a pretty practical way to measure whether all our religious opinions and practices amount to anything good. We can know our feelings. We can know our perceptions. We can come to know and understand our thoughts. And in that knowing, we can choose what is good. We can create lives and communities that bring life and freedom and minimize suffering. It's not automatic, and we can lose our way. But this is truly amazing and astounding. That possibility lies open, and we can continually embrace it, and we can celebrate it. And that would make our religious commitments truly amazing and astounding.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.